Forget everything you think you know about who truly saved Rome. History often overlooks the most impactful figures. What if I told you the fate of the Western Roman Empire didn't rest on the shoulders of emperors, but on the strategic brilliance of an empress? Welcome to my channel Words of Time, and prepare to have your perspective radically shifted as we uncover the astonishing story of Galla Placidia. The 5th century is often remembered as a time of collapse, uncertainty, and slow disintegration, a long twilight in which one of the most influential powers in history lost the ability to command its own lands. To later generations, it can seem as if the Western Roman Empire was fated to fall, as if the events that unfolded across these decades had been scripted in advance. Yet to the people who lived through those years, the outcome was not clear. They lived inside the storm. They felt its force in ways that were personal, painful, and immediate. The empire that had once stretched across a vast part of Europe, North Africa, and the Near East struggled to keep its frontiers intact and preserve the authority that had defined Roman life for centuries. Roads that had once carried troops, freight, and officials fell into disrepair. Cities that had prospered under imperial protection found themselves vulnerable. The world that Roman citizens had assumed would endure found itself tested again and again, and no one could be sure whether the state they depended on would survive the next crisis. During this period, the Goths became central figures in the drama. Their presence along the frontiers had long been a concern for imperial officials, but by the early years of this century, they were no longer a distant pressure. They moved through Roman lands, sometimes as allies, sometimes as enemies, and at times as desperate refugees seeking stability after their own displacements. Their fate became tied to the fate of Rome itself. Armies that had once been able to repel or absorb such groups struggled to manage them. The balance that had held for generations faltered. As the Goths advanced and Roman resources thinned, panic spread in some areas while resignation took hold in others. Even the most loyal subjects sensed that the structures around them were weakening. Each new emergency revealed deeper problems that had been building beneath the surface. Amid this turmoil stood Galla Placidia, a woman whose life was shaped by the extremes of imperial privilege and the harsh realities of a world in crisis. She was not simply a royal figure who observed events from a distance. She lived inside the shifting ground of the era and felt its dangers directly. Her birth placed her at the heart of Roman power. She was the daughter of Theodosius I, a ruler remembered for his efforts to preserve unity within the empire during his own troubled reign. She grew up with 2 brothers who would later rule different halves of the Roman world. Honorius held the western throne, while Arcadius oversaw the eastern half. Their reigns were marked by tension, rivalry, and the wide gulf between the dream of imperial stability and the difficult conditions of late Roman rule. From childhood, Galla Placidia understood that her family was more than a collection of relatives. It was a political institution. Every choice they made carried weight, and each of them had a role to play in shaping the empire. Her early years were spent in an environment filled with military officials, court advisors, clerics, and envoys from far-reaching provinces. She learned the rhythms of imperial life. She also saw how fragile authority could be, even for those born into the highest rank. Her father's last years were filled with challenges that left a deep impression on her, including the conflicts that followed the death of the Emperor Valentinian II and the struggle to maintain order in both halves of the empire. When Theodosius died, his sons took up his mantle, but their youth and the divided structure of the empire created space for powerful generals and advisors to shape policy. Galla Placidia entered adulthood just as the 5th century began to reveal the full weight of its problems. The Western Empire, under her brother Honorius, faced pressure unlike anything it had seen since the turbulent years of the 3rd century. The frontiers along the Rhine and Danube could no longer be held with confidence. The army, once the pride of Roman power, depended more heavily on federated troops whose loyalty shifted with circumstance. The central government, stretched thin, struggled to support its territories. Urban life began to show signs of decline. Infrastructure that had once been maintained with care and precision began to erode. Roads that had connected far-flung provinces showed signs of damage. Aqueducts that had fed cities suffered from lack of oversight. Public works that had symbolized the wealth and order of Rome carried signs of decay. Even citizens who had little interest in politics could see that something profound was changing in the world around them. The Goths, led at various points by figures such as Alaric, became a powerful symbol of this change. Although they had been allies at times and had even fought on behalf of Rome, they were also a group that had been wronged by Roman officials who mistreated them or broke promises that had been made to them. Their resentment, combined with their need for land and stability, drove them to take actions that shook the Western Empire to its core. When they approached Rome itself, the shock was felt across the entire Mediterranean. The city had long been more than a political center. It was a symbol of the continuity of Roman identity. Even though the emperors now lived elsewhere, Rome still held deep emotional meaning. To imagine the Goths near its gates was to imagine the world collapsing. Galla Placidia did not observe these developments from a safe distance. She found herself drawn into them in ways few imperial women ever experienced. When the Gothic forces moved closer to the capital and the threat became real, she was present. Her position as a member of the ruling family made her an asset, a captive of high value, and at times a figure who could serve as a bridge between opposing sides. Her capture by the Goths placed her in a world far removed from the courtly life of her youth. She lived among the people who had become Rome's greatest fear and learned their motivations, their needs, and their grievances. This experience changed her understanding of the forces that were reshaping the empire. It also revealed her capacity for resilience. Living in Gothic custody could have crushed her, but instead it became a turning point. She adapted, observed, and strengthened her resolve. Unlike many who experienced the terror of war, she gained insight into both sides of the conflict. She came to understand the desperation that drove the Goths and the internal weaknesses that left Rome unable to respond effectively. Her time among them also transformed her personal life in ways that echoed across the empire. Her marriage to Ataulf, a Gothic leader, surprised many and angered others, yet it was also a political and emotional union that reflected the complex world they inhabited. Some Romans saw it as a humiliation. Others saw it as a chance for peace. To Galla Placidia, it was both a necessity and a moment of human connection in a time of turmoil. Her return to Roman territory after Ataulf's death placed her once again in the center of imperial life, but she came back changed. She had known loss, uncertainty, and captivity. She had lived through experiences that few imperial women had endured. These trials sharpened her understanding of how fragile the empire had become. When she resumed her role in the West, she did so with a perspective that set her apart from her peers. She had seen the empire from the outside and knew that Rome could no longer rely on tradition or past strength to survive. It needed leaders who understood the new world taking shape around it. Her later marriage to Constantius brought her closer to the mechanisms of power in the Western Empire. He was a skilled general and a key figure in attempting to restore order. With him, she entered the next phase of her political life, one that would grow even more intense after his death. As mother to Valentinian III, who would eventually become emperor, she took on the role of regent. In this role she displayed a combination of patience, insight, and firmness that few expected from her. She worked to maintain balance among rival factions at court, safeguard the authority of her young son, and stabilize the lands still loyal to the Western throne. Her efforts could not reverse all the damage done to the empire, but they slowed its decline and preserved its institutions at a time when collapse seemed imminent. She faced an environment in which influential generals, court officials, and provincial leaders all vied for influence. Some of these men saw the imperial family as a ceremonial presence rather than a source of genuine authority. Others respected her resolve and intelligence. She managed these personalities with care and strategic judgment. Her ability to endure personal loss and political crisis gave her a grounded perspective. She knew the cost of failure. She understood the dangers of internal division. Throughout her regency, she sought to ensure that the Western Empire did not break apart from within, even as external pressures mounted. The Goths continued to shape the destiny of the empire during these years, but Galla Placidia's earlier experience with them gave her insight into how to approach such groups with caution and negotiation rather than fear alone. She supported efforts to maintain alliances and to manage federated troops with respect and clear communication. She understood that Rome could not afford to rely on force alone. The empire needed cooperation and mutual benefit if it hoped to endure. Her years in power revealed her strength of character. She was steadfast but never rigid. She was careful but never timid. She listened, learned, and acted in ways that reflected both her personal experiences and her deep understanding of the responsibilities she carried. Many rulers of the time found themselves overwhelmed by the shifting landscape. She remained steady. Although she could not stop every crisis, she navigated them with a clarity shaped by hardship and shaped by the knowledge that the empire she fought to protect was no longer the empire of her childhood. Her influence extended into religious life as well. She supported churches, helped guide doctrinal debates, and strengthened the bond between the imperial family and the growing Christian identity of the empire. Her patronage left marks on architecture and the spiritual culture of the time. Structures associated with her reflect not only her devotion but also her understanding that faith had become an essential part of Roman unity. She saw religion as a stabilizing force that could help hold communities together even as political structures weakened. Galla Placidia's life unfolded against the backdrop of events that seemed larger than any one person could manage. Yet her presence at key moments shows that individuals could still shape the course of history even in times of upheaval. She was never a passive witness. She was a participant who moved through the heart of the crisis and emerged with a clearer vision of the world than many around her. She belonged to a generation that lived through fear, siege, loss, and constant change, yet she carried herself with dignity and resolve. Her actions did not save the Western Empire from eventual fall, but they helped maintain its institutions for a longer time and offered moments of stability in an age defined by uncertainty. Her story captures the complexity of the 5th century. It was an age when old structures weakened, but people continued to struggle, adapt, and hope. Rome did not fall in a single moment. It unraveled slowly, shaped by countless decisions, alliances, conflicts, and failures. In this long process, Galla Placidia stood at the intersection of personal fate and imperial history. Her life reflects the tension between the legacy of a once mighty empire and the changing world that grew in its shadow. To understand her is to understand the final century of the Western Roman Empire not as an abstract collapse but as a human story. It is a story of a woman born into a dynasty at the height of its power who lived to see that power weaken at its foundations. It is a story of survival, of learning to move between cultures, of navigating a political world filled with rivals and shifting loyalties. It is a story of resilience in the face of forces that reshaped the map of Europe and altered the course of history. When we look at this era, it is easy to focus on battles, invasions, and the gradual loss of territory. Yet the people who lived through it experienced it in ways far more personal. Galla Placidia lived with the fear of siege, the sorrow of loss, the anxiety of political intrigue, and the hope that her actions might preserve what was left of the Roman world. She understood that empires are made of people, not only borders and armies. Through her efforts as daughter, captive, wife, mother, and regent, she carried forward the legacy of her family in a world that seemed to be falling apart. Her legacy reminds us that even in the final years of the Western Empire, Rome was more than a fading power. It was a place where individuals still fought to hold things together, where leadership could still matter, and where courage could still shine. She stood at the turning point between an ancient world and a new one. Her life offers a window into the human side of an age often described only in terms of decline. By understanding her role, we gain a deeper sense of what it meant to live in a world on the brink and to hold fast to hope in a time when the future seemed uncertain. Her capture by Alaric and the Visigoths marked a turning point that no one in the Roman court could have predicted. Until that moment, she had lived a life shaped by dynastic duty, ceremony, and the constant presence of guards and advisors who protected members of the imperial household. When the Visigothic forces moved toward Rome and the city surrendered after months of fear and hunger, she became one of the most prized captives in their hands. Her removal from the world she knew was sudden. Her imperial status could not protect her. The guards who once bowed to her were gone. The halls where she had spent her youth were replaced by camps, unfamiliar voices, and the uncertainty of life among a people Rome called outsiders. This loss of control exposed her vulnerability in ways she had never imagined. The daughter of Theodosius I entered an environment where her name held value only as a political asset, not as a shield against hardship. The early period of her captivity was filled with confusion. She had been raised to understand political dangers within the empire, yet she had not expected to face danger from outside it so directly. Alaric's forces treated her with care, not from compassion but because of the advantage she represented. She became leverage, a living symbol of Rome's weakness and a potential bargaining tool as the Visigoths demanded land, food, and recognition. Even so, the men around her respected her rank in their own way. They understood the weight her presence carried. She was no ordinary prisoner. She was a woman whose lineage tied her directly to the ruling family of both East and West. In these first months she learned to observe rather than react. She studied the men who commanded the Visigoths. She heard their arguments about Roman broken promises and the need for a homeland where their people could live without constant fear of betrayal. She listened to their frustration, their anger, and their hope. Over time she came to see that these were not simply raiders seeking plunder. Many of them carried memories of lost lands, families torn apart, and years of struggle along the frontier. Their grievances were real, shaped by long histories of mistrust that Roman leaders had often ignored. She had been raised to view Rome as the stabilizing force of the world, yet captivity forced her to face a different truth. Rome had grown inconsistent, stretched thin, and at times careless with those who relied on its promises. As the months passed, her vulnerability began to take on a different shape. Instead of weakening her, it revealed a strength she had not known she possessed. Without the shelter of the imperial court, she relied on her intelligence, restraint, and ability to read the shifting moods of those around her. These qualities drew the attention of the Gothic leadership. They saw that she carried herself with composure even in fear, and that she understood the gravity of the world that surrounded them. Her dignity under pressure earned her a quiet respect among people who valued endurance. Captivity, which could have crushed her spirit, instead strengthened it. Alaric's death created uncertainty within the Visigothic ranks. His successor, Ataulf, inherited both the leadership of the group and the delicate political value of the imperial princess in his custody. Ataulf differed from his predecessor in temperament and long-term goals. He had known Roman life more closely than most Gothic leaders, having spent time in Roman service during earlier alliances. He understood the appeal of Roman culture, Roman law, and the complex structure that had held so many lands together for centuries. He also recognized the symbolic value of Galla Placidia. In her he saw more than a captive. He saw a bridge between two worlds. The relationship that developed between them surprised observers across the Mediterranean. Their marriage was unexpected, almost unthinkable to both Romans and Visigoths, yet it took shape gradually as respect grew into trust. This union reflected the new reality of the age. Old boundaries between Rome and the peoples beyond its borders had blurred. Alliances were no longer simple arrangements of convenience. They were born out of shared experience and mutual need. Galla Placidia entered this marriage not as a defeated prisoner, but as a woman who had gained a deeper understanding of the forces shaping her world. Her union with Ataulf symbolized the complex path the empire was taking. Rome could no longer rely on separation from those it once considered outsiders. The future depended on negotiation, adaptation, and cooperation. The marriage brought her into a new form of political life. She moved with the Visigothic group as they searched for a stable home. Their journey took them through territories once firmly under Roman control. She observed how different communities responded to the sight of a people Rome had long described as threatening. She saw fear, hostility, and at times sympathy. These experiences allowed her to understand the depth of instability throughout the Western Empire. Regions that had once thrived under imperial administration now struggled to manage basic order. Local leaders lacked resources. Farmers fled the countryside in search of safety. Miscommunication between provincial officials and the central government created confusion. Through these travels she gained first-hand knowledge of the weaknesses Rome tried to conceal. She also saw how the Visigoths, despite their martial reputation, sought stability more than destruction. Her marriage to Ataulf reached a poignant moment with the birth of their son. For a brief time she carried hope for a future in which the two worlds might join through a child who bore the bloodline of both sides. This hope was shared by many within Ataulf's circle and by some beyond it who believed that unity might be possible. The child represented a new path, one where old divisions might loosen. But the child's death during infancy extinguished that hope. The loss hit both parents deeply. For Galla Placidia, the grief added to the sorrow she had already suffered. She had lost her father, been separated from her brothers, and endured the uncertainty of captivity. The death of her son marked another wound that shaped her spirit. Ataulf's death soon followed, the result of internal disputes among Gothic factions. His murder plunged the group into disarray and stripped Galla Placidia of the protection he had provided. Leadership passed to men who had no interest in maintaining the respectful treatment she had received. Her value as a political figure remained, but her position became more precarious. Some saw her as a burden. Others saw her as a bargaining chip. The internal instability of the Visigoths during this period placed her at risk once again. Her fate depended on calculations made by men who debated whether to use her to secure food, passage, or political advantage. Eventually her return to Roman territory was negotiated. For the first time in years, she found herself under the authority of her own people. Yet the home she returned to was not the home she had left. The Western Empire had continued to decline. Court politics had grown more hostile. Her brother Honorius had aged under the strain of leadership and had grown increasingly dependent on advisors. The empire struggled with financial shortage, shrinking military strength, and instability along its borders. Her years among the Visigoths had taught her how fragile Rome had become. Now, seeing it again from within, she became aware of how deep the damage was. She returned not as a sheltered princess but as a woman who had lived through displacement, war, and alliance with those Rome feared. Her experiences shaped her re-entry into Roman politics. She possessed knowledge few Romans had, including insight into the motivations of the Goths and the internal demands that guided them. She knew that they were not driven only by aggression but also by a need for security and fairness. She understood the importance of treating federated groups with consistency and respect. Her marriage to Ataulf had given her a sense of how leaders outside Rome viewed the empire. That understanding would become essential as she re-entered the political arena. Upon her return, she was placed under the control of Constantius, the general who served as the dominant military figure in the Western court. Constantius recognized her political value and persuaded her brother to approve their marriage. This union was arranged for strategic benefit rather than personal preference. Yet Galla Placidia accepted it with the same resilience that had carried her through captivity. She knew that the marriage offered stability for herself and restored her formal role in imperial life. It also allowed her to influence the direction of the empire from a position of legitimacy. She bore 2 children, including the future Emperor Valentinian III. Through them she regained a place at the very center of Roman politics. Constantius's death opened another chapter in her life. Once again she faced uncertainty, this time within the Roman court itself. Rivalries grew intense. Officials sought to use her influence for their own ambitions. The court's internal divisions placed her in danger. She fled to the Eastern Empire for safety and found refuge with her brother Arcadius's successors. This period of refuge allowed her to strengthen ties between East and West and to prepare for the role that awaited her when her son was placed on the Western throne. Her eventual return to the Western Empire as the mother of a young emperor marked the moment when her years of hardship took on political meaning. Her time among the Visigoths had taught her negotiation, patience, and awareness of the needs of diverse groups. These qualities became essential as she worked to stabilize a government that was falling apart. She had seen the world from the vantage point of both sides of the frontier. Her experience created a rare perspective that shaped the policies she supported. She worked to manage federated troops with greater care. She understood that resentment grew when promises were broken. She urged advisors and generals to consider the long-term consequences of short-term decisions. Her voice carried the weight of personal experience. She had lived through the consequences of Roman mismanagement. Now she sought to prevent the same failures from repeating. Her years as regent revealed a leader who remained calm under pressure. She navigated disputes among generals, confronted rivals who sought to control her son, and worked to maintain the authority of the Western throne. She moved with caution, but she acted with firm intent when necessary. Her resilience had been forged during captivity and loss, and it allowed her to withstand the political storms of the court. Her earlier connection to the Visigoths also helped shape her approach to diplomacy. She supported efforts to maintain workable relationships with Gothic groups settled in Roman territory. She understood the importance of mutual respect and the dangers of treating allied groups as perpetual outsiders. Her influence encouraged a more balanced approach during a time when military desperation often pushed leaders to rash actions. Throughout this period she called upon her past not as a source of trauma but as a source of strength. The vulnerability she had once felt as a captive had taught her adaptability. The respect she had gained among the Visigoths had shown her that leadership came not from rank alone but from character. The grief she had known had given her patience and empathy. These qualities helped her steady the government during the early years of her son's reign. Her return to power completed a journey few could have imagined when she was first carried away from Rome as a captive. She had moved through the camps of the Visigoths, the uncertainties of political marriage, the grief of losing a child, the danger of internal Roman rivalries, and the challenges of serving as regent in a fractured empire. Through each stage she gained knowledge that strengthened her sense of purpose. The imperial princess who had once relied on the protection of others became a woman who could guide the fate of the Western Empire with her own judgment. Her story shows that captivity did not break her. Instead, it altered her path in ways that allowed her to become a figure of quiet strength. Her connection to both Roman and Gothic worlds gave her insight that no other leader of her time possessed. The unexpected marriage to Ataulf and the birth of their son added depth to her understanding of the new world taking shape beyond Rome's borders. These experiences prepared her for the political life she would lead upon her return, a life shaped by resilience, adaptation, and a sense of responsibility to a world struggling to hold itself together. Through her journey, she carried forward a vision shaped by hardship and insight. Her rise from captive to central figure in Roman politics stands as one of the most remarkable transformations of her age. She returned not diminished but sharpened by experience, ready to confront the unfolding challenges of an empire on the edge. Her marriage to Constantius III returned her to the center of Roman power with a speed and intensity that few could have foreseen. After her release from Visigothic custody, she was still adjusting to life within the walls of the empire when Constantius pressed for their union. The marriage was not born from affection. It was a calculated move crafted in the halls of the Western court, where generals had long overshadowed emperors and where lineage served as a political instrument. Constantius understood that joining himself to the daughter of Theodosius I would legitimize his influence. Galla Placidia, aware of the fragile state of the Western Empire, accepted the marriage with the same steady resolve that had carried her through captivity and loss. Her acceptance was not passive. She recognized that the empire needed stability, and by stepping back into the role that fate had prepared for her, she could shape decisions that would matter for generations. The marriage bound her to a man skilled in military command and seasoned in managing the tensions that plagued the Western territories. Constantius had spent years directing campaigns that kept various groups at bay, and he had grown familiar with the unreliable network of federated troops on which Rome depended. He had a reputation for discipline and strategic sense, yet he lacked the innate authority that came from imperial heritage. Galla Placidia's presence corrected that imbalance. Together they formed a partnership that blended military prowess with dynastic legitimacy. Their union restored a degree of confidence at court, at least for a short period. She was no longer a captive princess whose fate had been shaped by the hands of others. She was once again a pillar of the imperial machine, though this time she carried insights that came from living among the very people Rome feared. The birth of their children, first a daughter and then a son named Valentinian, gave her even greater significance. The future of the Western Empire now flowed through her line. For a brief moment it appeared that the turbulence of the era might be slowed by this resurgence of dynastic continuity. Yet the hopes raised by her marriage were cut short when Constantius died not long after being named co-emperor. His sudden death left the Western court in chaos. Without his presence, rivals scrambled for control, and factions resumed their old patterns of intrigue. Galla Placidia found herself once again at the center of political storms, this time without the shield of a husband and without certainty about who she could trust. One of the most immediate threats came from the unpredictable influence of her brother Honorius, whose judgment had grown increasingly unstable. His reliance on advisors who sought to manipulate him threatened her safety. The court became hostile as jealous voices sought to undermine her authority. Accusations were whispered that she aimed to control Honorius. Others argued that her growing favor among certain generals posed a danger. Tension escalated to the point where she and her children fled the Western Empire and sought refuge in the Eastern Court, a move that would shape her political future. Her time in the East strengthened her position. She found a safer environment in the Palace of Constantinople, where her Theodosian lineage held enduring weight. Eastern officials recognized the importance of maintaining unity between the two halves of the empire, especially as threats continued to grow along multiple frontiers. The Eastern Court also understood that her son Valentinian represented the most legitimate heir to the Western throne. When Honorius died, the West briefly drifted into deeper disorder. A usurper rose with support from factions eager to expand their own power. The East rejected his claim. With firm support from Constantinople, Galla Placidia and her son were escorted westward so that Valentinian could be placed on the throne under her guidance. Her return to the Western Empire as the mother of a child emperor marked the beginning of her most influential period. She took on the role of regent with a seriousness shaped by her long history of hardship and observation. She understood the dangers that had weakened Rome. She understood the consequences of poor alliances, broken agreements, and careless leadership. Having lived among the Visigoths and seen the empire's failures from both inside and outside, she was determined to steady the government for as long as she could. Her regency required constant attention to the intricate dynamics of the court. She faced generals whose ambitions threatened the boy emperor's authority. She dealt with officials who trusted no one but themselves. She confronted factions that believed the empire was slipping out of reach and viewed her leadership with suspicion. Through careful decisions, she worked to prevent any single general from overwhelming the imperial household. She encouraged balance and sought to contain the rivalries that had repeatedly torn the Western court apart. One of her earliest and most important strategic maneuvers involved managing the relationship with the powerful general Aetius. His influence grew rapidly, and although he did not always align himself with her preferences, she recognized his ability to defend the empire against threats from both internal competitors and groups beyond the borders. Their relationship was marked by moments of tension, yet shaped by mutual recognition of each other's necessity. She knew that dismissing him outright would risk civil war. Instead, she maintained a careful dance of cooperation, reinforcing imperial authority while allowing him enough room to act against external enemies. This balance helped prevent the West from collapsing sooner than it did. She also worked to maintain steady ties with the Visigoths. Her intimate understanding of their motives allowed her to shape negotiations with a clarity that other Roman leaders lacked. She advised caution and urged the court to avoid rash decisions. She knew that the Visigoths sought land and status, not endless conflict. Under her guidance, agreements were formed that allowed them to settle in regions under Roman control as federated allies. These arrangements bought the empire time, though they did not offer permanent solutions. She believed in practical diplomacy rooted in her experiences rather than in rigid policies shaped by outdated assumptions. Another example of her strategic sense appeared in her handling of the Vandals, who grew stronger in North Africa. The region had once been one of Rome's most prosperous provinces, vital for its grain supply. She understood the danger of losing control there and sought alliances that could limit Vandal expansion. She also supported efforts to strengthen ties with certain African leaders who still remained loyal to Rome. Although these attempts did not fully stop the Vandals, her foresight delayed the loss of the region and allowed the imperial court time to prepare responses. Her approach to governing also extended into religious affairs. She supported the building and restoration of churches, understanding that faith had become a central source of cohesion for communities across the empire. Her patronage helped maintain unity within Christian groups at a time when doctrinal disputes often spilled into politics. She used religion as a stabilizing force, not as a tool for division. Her influence encouraged cooperation between bishops and government officials, helping reduce tensions in regions where unrest could easily have escalated. Her decisions were not simply reactions to crisis. They were shaped by a larger vision of what the empire could still preserve. She knew that the Western Empire lacked the strength it once had. She did not expect miracles. Instead, she sought to slow the pace of decline, to preserve institutions, and to maintain order long enough for her son to rule with some stability. Her strategies were subtle, built on patience and deep awareness of the motives of the many groups that interacted with Rome. Court intrigues continued throughout her regency. Some rival factions sought to sideline her, claiming that she held too much influence. Certain military leaders imagined themselves as saviors of the empire and pushed against her authority. Yet she remained steady, never allowing personal pride to override her judgment. She communicated with caution, kept her allies close, and used her knowledge of both Roman and non-Roman politics to counter threats. Her composure during these disputes earned her respect, though it did not erase the tensions that defined the era. Her understanding of diplomacy and conflict was grounded in personal experience rather than theory. She had seen how desperation could drive groups to hostility. She had watched leaders struggle to manage people who felt deceived by broken promises. She had lived through the consequences of miscalculation. These memories guided her choices. She urged practical solutions rather than dramatic gestures. She sought compromise where others wanted confrontation. She valued long-term stability over short-term victories. One of her most effective strategies was maintaining communication with various frontier groups. She supported envoys who traveled to negotiate with leaders outside the empire. She understood that treating these groups with consistent respect reduced the likelihood of sudden uprisings. Her approach differed from the traditional Roman stance, which often relied on displays of force. She believed that force alone would not save the Western Empire. Too many resources had been lost. Too many armies had been weakened. Diplomacy was no longer optional. It was essential. Her efforts delayed collapse, even if she could not prevent it altogether. Territories that might have broken away earlier remained under imperial influence longer than expected. Internal conflicts that could have turned into full-scale civil wars were managed or avoided entirely. Frontier groups that could have become hostile remained neutral or cooperative for significant periods. Her leadership created breathing room for the government in a time when every moment mattered. The insights she brought to the political chessboard came from her rare journey across the boundaries of Roman and non-Roman worlds. Few leaders in her era understood both sides as she did. Her years among the Visigoths had taught her patience and awareness. Her years in the Roman court had taught her political discipline. These experiences allowed her to see possibilities that others overlooked. While many Roman leaders clung to outdated assumptions, she embraced the realities of the time and worked within them. Her regency was not defined by triumphs but by resilience. She held the empire together through determination, intelligence, and dedication. She stood against forces that sought to fracture what remained of Roman authority. She guarded her son's position and secured his claim. She protected the stability of the court as long as circumstances allowed. Her influence remained strong until Valentinian came of age, at which point her formal authority began to wane. Yet even as her role changed, her presence remained a reminder of what the empire had endured and what it still fought to preserve. Her story during these years reflects the broader struggle of the Western Empire. It was a struggle to maintain coherence in a world filled with pressures from within and without. It was a struggle shaped by memory, adaptation, and constant negotiation. Galla Placidia played her part with a rare blend of strength and humility. She acted not with the arrogance of someone born into power, but with the steady insight of someone who had seen power crumble and survive in unexpected ways. Through her decisions, she carved out pockets of stability in an age of crisis. She extended the life of institutions that would otherwise have fallen sooner. She safeguarded the lineage that connected Rome to its past. Her leadership in this period shows that even during decline, the empire still produced figures capable of shaping events with clarity and purpose. Her journey from captive to strategist reveals a woman whose life reflected the changing world around her. She understood that survival required flexibility. She recognized that shifting alliances and practical solutions were the only paths forward. She carried the memory of both hardship and privilege, blending them into a form of leadership adapted to the demands of her age. Her time as regent stands as a testament to that unique blend of experience, one that allowed her to see advantage where others saw only danger and to guide an empire that needed every moment of stability it could claim. Her years at the height of influence revealed another side of her leadership, a side shaped not only by political necessity but by a desire to preserve something of Rome's spirit for the generations that might follow. She knew that the empire her son would inherit was weaker than the one of her childhood. She had watched its borders shrink, its armies strain under pressure, and its officials quarrel over authority rather than commit to shared purpose. In this atmosphere, she sought to cultivate a sense of continuity, a sense that Rome still held meaning even as time eroded the power it once wielded. Her regency was not only a political effort. It was also a cultural and spiritual project. Through careful guidance, she nurtured what remained of the empire's traditions and encouraged forms of beauty that could uplift a people worn down by war, fear, and uncertainty. She had grown up in a world where symbols mattered. Her father had understood the power of architecture and ritual, and her upbringing had familiarized her with courts shaped by ceremony and visual splendor. Later, during her captivity, she learned how much these symbols meant not only to the powerful but also to the common people. She realized that buildings, rituals, and public spaces could steady the heart of a society, reminding people that they belonged to something larger than their hardships. With these memories in mind, she turned a portion of her energy toward strengthening the cultural life of the empire. She wanted Rome, or at least the idea of Rome, to endure. Her most visible contributions came through her patronage of churches. Christianity had become central to the empire's identity, and she believed that spiritual unity could support political unity. Her own devotion, sharpened by years of trials, played a role in this. Loss had taught her to turn toward faith, and she saw in the growing Christian world a way to give the people around her a sense of purpose. She supported the construction and restoration of churches in Ravenna and other cities, each building reflecting a commitment to both artistic refinement and communal stability. These churches combined Roman tradition with newer styles that were beginning to define Christian architecture. Their mosaics, soft light, and balanced forms offered comfort and beauty during troubled times. She did not build for extravagance. She built for memory. She wanted each structure to remind future generations that Rome had once given rise to order, devotion, and artistic achievement. She wanted her son to inherit a realm that still carried pride in its spiritual foundations. These projects also strengthened ties between the imperial court and local bishops, whose influence had grown as political institutions weakened. By supporting religious construction, she forged bonds with these leaders, recognizing that their cooperation was essential if the empire was to maintain some measure of unity. Her building efforts extended beyond churches. She also supported repairs to public works that had suffered neglect in the years before her rise to power. Roads and aqueducts, once cared for with precision, now bore the marks of war and administrative decay. She understood the symbolic importance of repairing them. These works represented the backbone of Roman order. Restoring them signaled that Rome still tried to uphold its responsibilities, even when its resources were limited. Though she could not repair everything, her efforts demonstrated that the government had not surrendered to decline. It still cared for the well-being of its people. In a world where trust in authority was slipping away, such gestures carried weight. Her artistic patronage often reflected her personal journey. Having lived through the discomfort of travel with the Visigoths, she respected the importance of safe roads and secure towns. Having experienced hunger during sieges, she appreciated the need for reliable water supply and functioning storage facilities. Her choices were rooted in practicality as much as in symbolism. She championed works that touched daily life, supporting improvements that could ease the burdens of communities under strain. She viewed infrastructure not only as a sign of Rome's endurance but also as a means of care for her people. Her influence on art and architecture also stemmed from her understanding of legacy. She knew that power was temporary. Governing coalitions shifted, alliances collapsed, and territories changed hands. But buildings endured. Mosaics endured. Churches endured. These creations could speak across generations even when political authority failed. She wanted her son to inherit more than a throne. She wanted him to inherit a culture worth defending. Her leadership during this period reflected a delicate balance between action and restraint. She could not command large armies or launch ambitious military campaigns. The empire lacked the strength for ventures of that scale. Instead, she acted through diplomacy, patronage, and the careful management of communities. She understood that influence could be exercised through the arts as well as through force. She believed that the empire needed stability not only in its borders but also in the hearts of its people. Through beauty and continuity, she tried to give them strength. The churches associated with her name still stand today as quiet testimony to her vision. Their interiors reflect a blend of Roman refinement and Christian symbolism. They carry an air of serenity that contrasts with the turmoil of the age in which they were built. Scholars often study them as early examples of Christian art, but they also represent her will to protect what remained of Roman culture. They illustrate her ability to translate personal faith into public expression, merging her private experiences with the responsibilities of her station. These buildings also reflected her wish to preserve something for her son. Valentinian's future depended on more than military alliances. It depended on the loyalty of his subjects, the coherence of his provinces, and the strength of his cultural inheritance. She wanted him to rule not a hollow title but a realm that still believed in its worth. She invested in projects that would remind him, and those around him, that Rome still had a soul worth defending. Her maternal instincts intertwined with her political objectives, shaping a kind of leadership rarely seen in imperial history. Her sense of responsibility to her son influenced nearly every decision she made during the regency. She had lived through abrupt reversals of fortune, through captivity, widowhood, exile, and return. These experiences sharpened her understanding of how quickly structures could crumble. She knew that Valentinian would face difficulties beyond her control. She wanted to give him every advantage she could, including the stability that came from a realm still rich in culture and faith. She nurtured his education with care, surrounding him with tutors who upheld tradition while preparing him for the complexities of the era. She tried to shape him into a ruler who understood the weight of his inheritance. Her efforts to foster stability extended to her management of political relationships. She encouraged modest reform where possible, though she recognized that large-scale changes were unrealistic. She sought to maintain harmony within the court, weighing the ambitions of generals against the needs of provinces. She did not indulge in idealism. Her decisions were shaped by the sobering truth that the Western Empire was in a state of gradual decline. Her goal was not to restore the past, but to slow the process enough for her son to govern meaningfully. This perspective set her apart from many of her contemporaries. Some leaders still spoke of restoring the empire to its old strength, ignoring the realities of depopulation, fiscal weakness, and fractured loyalty. Others surrendered to despair and managed their responsibilities with resignation. She chose a middle path. She acknowledged the difficulties yet rejected defeat. She acted with the belief that careful stewardship could still make a difference. Her optimism was quiet but persistent, rooted in experience rather than fantasy. Her personal history made her efforts all the more compelling. She had been born in a palace, where she saw the empire at its height. She had been carried away by a foreign army, where she saw the fragility of that power. She had married a Gothic king and glimpsed a world that existed beyond the Roman perspective. She had returned to the court with knowledge of both sides of the frontier. She had been a widow twice and had faced rivalries that threatened her life. Through every trial she had adapted without abandoning her sense of duty. This journey shaped the image she projected to the world. People saw in her a blend of resilience and humility. She represented both the glory of Rome's past and the struggle of its present. Her life embodied the empire's contradictions. She had lived through triumph and defeat, wealth and deprivation, imperial ceremony and wandering exile. Every part of her story echoed the larger story of the Western Empire. Her endurance mirrored Rome's endurance. Her losses mirrored Rome's losses. Her hopes mirrored Rome's hopes. Her presence reassured many within the empire. They saw in her a reminder that Rome still had leaders who cared deeply for its fate. They saw a woman who had not turned away from responsibility even when it brought pain. They saw a mother fighting for her son's inheritance with the same determination that Romans once believed protected the entire Mediterranean world. Her character inspired trust, a trust that often helped her keep fragile alliances intact. Her influence on artistic and spiritual life helped strengthen that trust. Churches built under her guidance became places of refuge and community. Public works restored at her direction served as reminders that the imperial system had not collapsed completely. These efforts nurtured a sense of continuity during times of turmoil. People needed assurance that the empire still meant something, and her patronage provided that assurance. Her story also illustrates the emotional dimension of leadership. She did not govern from detachment. Her decisions were shaped by memory, loss, love, and the weight of responsibility. She governed not only as a regent but as a mother, as a daughter of Theodosius, and as a woman who understood the fragility of human life. This depth of perspective influenced her choices and gave her leadership a quality distinct from the generals and politicians around her. Though she could not halt the empire's downward course forever, her efforts preserved enough stability for her son to rule during his formative years. The empire did not collapse under her watch. She held it together with the threads available to her. Her influence provided Rome with some of its last moments of cultural strength before the pressures of the coming decades overwhelmed what remained of its institutions. Her legacy is not measured in victories or conquests. It is measured in preservation. She slowed the pace of decline. She nurtured the cultural heart of the empire. She protected the institutions that still had life in them. She raised a son who carried the Theodosian lineage into a new generation. She built churches that still stand as evidence of her devotion. She restored works that prolonged the functioning of cities. She left behind an imprint shaped by experience, faith, and a sense of duty that never wavered. In her life we see a portrait of Rome itself during its final century. She was born into strength, grew up amid uncertainty, endured loss, adapted to new realities, and fought to preserve what she could. She did not surrender to despair. She did not cling blindly to the past. She worked within the limits of her era with clarity and persistence. Through her journey, she became a symbol of the Western Empire's struggle for survival, embodying both its resilience and its vulnerability. Her story remains a testament to how one individual, shaped by hardship and responsibility, can influence the course of history even when the world around them begins to fade. Her later years invite reflection on what her work meant for the empire she tried so hard to steady. By the time she stepped back from the center of power, The Western Empire was already strained by shifting loyalties, weakened resources, and rival generals whose interests pulled in different directions. Her earlier decisions continued to shape political life long after she no longer held direct control, and their influence can be traced through the final decades of the Western court. Her presence had created a temporary balance among powerful figures who, without her, found little reason to restrain their ambitions. When she had acted as regent, she kept these forces in check through a mixture of diplomacy, personal authority, and careful management. Once she could no longer serve as that stabilizing force, many of the tensions she had contained began to break loose. Her long-term impact can be seen in the way she preserved the legitimacy of the Theodosian line. Her son's position depended on her ability to navigate intrigue and opposition, and her efforts gave him a throne that might otherwise have been taken by a rival. This continuity, though fragile, helped maintain a sense of lawful rule during years when the empire's political structures were under heavy strain. Her involvement in the court had created rhythms of governance that kept the bureaucracy functioning. Tax collectors still operated. Provincial officials still received instructions. Bishops still communicated with the court. These patterns, sustained during her regency, helped delay the breakdown of administrative order. Her influence also extended into the realm of diplomacy. She had forged relationships that later leaders relied upon, even when they lacked her skill in maintaining them. Her dealings with generals, barbarian leaders, and provincial elites created precedents that shaped the expectations of those who followed her. She had shown that negotiation could preserve the empire's borders for a time, even when military force alone could not. Later rulers attempted to follow her example, though with uneven success. Some of the treaties she helped shape allowed the empire to survive a few more years, postponing the collapse that many expected to come sooner. Her patronage of religious and cultural institutions also left a lasting imprint. The churches she supported became centers of influence that outlasted the empire itself. These buildings became landmarks of continuity in the centuries after the fall of the Western court. They preserved artistic traditions, shaped local identity, and strengthened the presence of Christian communities that would define the region long after imperial authority disappeared. Her constructions not only offered spiritual comfort in her own time, but also carried forward the memory of a society that valued beauty even in hardship. For future generations, these churches became reminders that creativity and faith could rise from a world in decline. Some of her choices, however, reflected the limitations placed upon her by circumstance. She prioritized stability over bold reform because she knew the empire lacked the ability to support ambitious policies. While this caution prevented sudden collapse, it also meant that deeper structural problems remained unaddressed. Her efforts to mediate between rival generals kept the peace for a time, but did not cure the divisions that ultimately weakened the armies. Her reliance on diplomacy with barbarian groups postponed conflict yet created situations in which future leaders struggled to manage competing promises and expectations. Her choices preserved the empire, but only within the boundaries set by its exhausted condition. This raises a question that historians repeatedly return to. Did she actually extend the life of the Western Empire, or did she simply slow the pace of decline without changing its outcome? The answer is not simple, and it depends on how one weighs individual agency against the broader forces that shape history. She certainly provided stability in a period that might have otherwise descended into chaos. Her leadership ensured that the government retained enough strength to address emergencies, pay troops, and negotiate with its neighbors. Without her presence, the court might have fallen into disorder years earlier, and the Theodosian line might have ended before her son reached adulthood. On the other hand, the empire faced challenges far beyond what one person could resolve. Depopulation, weakened finances, shifting trade routes, internal division, and the relentless pressure of groups seeking land or security along its borders all contributed to its fragile state. She could not reverse these forces. Even the most capable ruler would have struggled to do more than she accomplished. Her work was a form of careful repair, not sweeping transformation. This makes her story a compelling example of how individuals influence history within the limits of their time. Her situation also prompts consideration of how a woman in her position shaped the course of events. She was not merely a figurehead. She made decisions that affected military deployments, diplomatic arrangements, and the composition of court leadership. She commanded loyalty through her lineage, her experience, and her personal resolve. Her authority was unconventional for her era, yet widely recognized. Many leaders who opposed each other found common ground in their respect for her. Her background as the daughter, sister, and mother of emperors gave her a legitimacy that few others possessed. Her survival through political turmoil gave her an edge in understanding the threats around her. Her capacity to influence events was shaped not only by her titles but also by her character. Her presence in the political arena showed that power in late Rome was not confined to generals or male courtiers. It also resided in those who understood the subtle workings of influence. She did not lead armies, but she advised those who did. She shaped policy through discussion, persuasion, and strategic patience. She interpreted the mood of the court, anticipated the ambitions of rivals, and used her insight to shape decisions that might otherwise have been reckless. Her leadership was indirect but no less real. It demonstrated that effective governance could come from those who worked behind the scenes, managing relationships and shaping the environment in which choices were made. Because of her unique background, she viewed the empire from multiple perspectives. She had lived in palaces, but she had also lived among the Visigoths. She understood both Roman pride and barbarian ambition. She knew what it meant to inherit power and what it meant to survive when that power vanished. These experiences taught her to see connections that others missed. Her marriage to a Gothic king gave her insight into the motives of leaders outside the empire. Her captivity revealed the vulnerability of Roman institutions. Her return to power showed her how to use knowledge gained in adversity. This understanding helped her make decisions that were often more measured and realistic than those of other court figures. The debate over her impact reflects a broader question about how history unfolds. Some argue that individuals can significantly alter events, while others believe that historical forces limit the effect of any single person. Her story suggests that both views contain truth. She changed the course of events in meaningful ways, yet she also worked within boundaries set by larger conditions. She did not alter the empire's overall trajectory, but she shaped how that trajectory unfolded. She slowed decline, softened its effects, and preserved fragments of culture and stability that might have otherwise disappeared sooner. Her legacy extends beyond political outcomes. She remains a figure of deep human interest, someone whose life encompassed privilege, loss, courage, and responsibility. She was a woman who grew from sheltered princess to hardened survivor, then from survivor to leader. Her journey reflected a shift from relying on inherited status to relying on tested wisdom. She learned through hardship, and she governed with that knowledge. Her life shows how experience can strengthen character and how character can shape decisions that influence an entire realm. She also stands as a reminder of the emotional dimension of power. She did not seek influence for glory. She accepted leadership because her son's future depended on it. She governed not from ambition but from duty and personal conviction. Her devotion to her son and to the memory of her father guided her choices. She wanted to leave behind a world that still honored the traditions she had inherited, even if the empire's strength had waned. This personal motivation gave her leadership a sincerity that resonated with those around her. Her later reputation grew gradually. 4 centuries after the fall of the Western Empire, chroniclers remembered her more for her lineage than for her achievements. Only later did scholars look more closely at her actions and recognize the significance of her role. Modern interest in her story highlights the complexity of the era she lived in and the depth of her involvement in shaping it. She has become a symbol of resilience during a time when the stability of an entire civilization hung in the balance. Her memory endures most clearly in the structures she helped create. The churches of Ravenna, with their mosaics and calm interiors, stand as living monuments to her hope that beauty could survive chaos. They reflect her desire to preserve the soul of Rome even when its political power faded. These buildings allow visitors to step into the world she shaped, a world that valued dignity even in decline. They speak more for her legacy than any inscription or record. Seen through the lens of her life, the final decades of the Western Empire appear less as a simple collapse and more as a long struggle shaped by individuals who refused to surrender. She belonged to a generation that faced extraordinary pressures, yet she carried herself with determination. Her actions reveal how much one person can accomplish even when events seem beyond control. She teaches us that leadership can take many forms, that influence does not always come from commanding armies, and that the preservation of culture can be as important as the preservation of borders. Her story also invites reflection on the resilience of empires. Great powers do not fall in a moment. They decline over years, shaped by decisions both wise and flawed, by pressures both internal and external. Within these years, individuals can still make choices that matter. She is proof that decline does not erase the value of effort. Her persistence shows that even in times of uncertainty, actions taken with care and conviction can leave a mark that outlasts political structures. Her place in history is well earned. She faced trials that would have broken many. She endured loss and danger yet returned to lead with clarity. She protected her son, upheld her family's legacy, and worked to preserve the cultural life of her people. She steered the empire through some of its darkest moments, not with triumphal strength but with steady resolve. Her story stands as a testament to how courage can shape the fate of nations. She emerges as a figure who embodied the final spirit of the Western Empire. She fought to protect a world she loved, even as that world changed beyond recognition. Her life reflects both the fragility and the endurance of human efforts in the face of great forces. She reminds us that the fate of empires rests not only on battles and treaties, but also on the quiet determination of those who refuse to abandon hope. Through her legacy, we see the strength of individuals who, even in decline, strive to hold their world together.